You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I am holding in my hand here the hardback copy of Macon to Manassas, the new War Between the States novel that was written by John Wayne Dobson and Kevin Sark, published by our very own Dixie Heritage Press. And we've been talking about it here for the last couple of weeks here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. It is Dixie Heritage Press's first publication that is fiction, and also the first publication that was not written by yours truly. And so today what we're going to do on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, we are going to have John Wayne Dobson, one of the two authors of this great novel, is our guest today. And we're going to talk about Macon to Manassas and some other things regarding Southern heritage. So our guest today is John Wayne Dobson, and he's the author of the new book just published, Macon to Manassas. Tell us, first of all, John, how did you get the name John Wayne? I mean, of all the names to be given, what a name.
Well, it really, John is kind of one of those names that goes through all the generations of our family. On my dad's side, everybody's name started with John, the first name. And actually, I was not named after that by any means. Wayne was simply a close friend of my mother's when she was growing up and liked it. Everyone assumes I was named after the actor, but it really wasn't so.
Well, that's probably a good thing, because if you were named after the actor, your parents might have named you Marion.
That's true. That's true.
That was the saddest day of my childhood. You talk about, when your bubble gets burst and you lose a hero.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was a teenager and found out that John Wayne's real name was Marion, and that was just a hard day for me.
It's kind of like that Johnny Cash song, The Boy Named Sue, kind of thing.
And I know this sounds bad, but ever since I learned that John Wayne was named Marion, for some reason I always associate that name with Marion Ross, who was the mother on Happy Days.
Oh, yes. Or it could be Frances Marion, the Swamp Fox, maybe. I don't know.
So tell us.
I would like to say this, but I was the co-author of this book. I have a very fine co-writer.
And so go ahead and tell us about Kevin Sark just a little bit.
Kevin and I have been friends for many years. We attended the same church together. Our families have been longtime friends. And, of course, we were reenactors in the 16th Georgia, still are, for many years there. He was actually the first sergeant of the unit for one time. And Kevin came to me one day and said, more or less, he said, you want to write a book? And I thought, well, all my life since I was 11 years old, I knew that I wanted to be a writer. That's been the one enduring passion of my life. And so I said, sure, I'm game. And then we got to thinking about what would we like to write about. There's so much. And I've always had a belief that I wanted to write about what was close to home, what I knew about. And I guess there was nothing we knew better than Macon, our hometown. And certainly we wanted to write about a unit that came from here. And as I said, there were many units that came from this vicinity. Probably, if I had to put it in rough figures, probably around 3,000 men out of this one county in Confederate combat units. That's an estimate, of course. So it was well represented in the war, and so we just wanted to try to draw a picture not only of the men who went to war, but the whole panorama that was the wartime Macon in the early part of the war. As you know, the book really only covers roughly 6 or 7 months of time in all of that expanse. So it's a very intimate look at Macon, at individuals. Some are real individuals, of course, being a historical fiction, and some are, fictional characters.
Right.
But
so to go backwards just a little bit, because we can talk more about the book here in a bit. Right now, I kind of want to just let our audience get to know the authors a little bit. Kind of what is your background? I know you talked about how you and Kevin had went to church together, had been involved in reenactments together and other activities. But I guess what is your pedigree? How did you become interested in the history of the South and in the history of Macon in particular, and how has that led to your involvement in groups like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and so forth? Just kind of give your pedigree as a Southerner, as a Maconite, as a historian.
Well, people ask me all the time, how did I get interested in that period of history? And do you recall the very best Christmas you had as a child? Maybe that nice bike you got, or something really special. Something that you really was probably the best Christmas you ever had, or the gift you really remember. For me, it was around 6 years old, maybe 7. I got a Civil War play set. The little blue and the gray sets, the figures and all of that.
Uh-huh.
And I adored that. I still have parts of it left. That was my very favorite thing. That for some reason that just consumed me. So, what does a 7-year-old know about that period of history? Really nothing. I think sometimes it reached out and grabbed me rather than me embracing it. Of course, being from Macon, it's my hometown, and my parents were here for many years. My parents were the kind of people that were always telling me history. In other words, we used to live here, we used to do this, we used to, things like that. I was kind of brought up, I guess, with an inherent interest in history in general. And I always wanted to be a reenactor. I thought that looks like great fun, like that. Finally, one day, I was almost 40 years old, I found a way to get involved. That could be a rude awakening, getting into a combat infantry reenacting outfit at 40 years old, but I survived it nonetheless. In fact, the 21st of this month was the 30th anniversary of that for me. But I went on with that, of course, and naturally, Sons of Confederate Veterans is very big in this area. We have quite a number of camps in this area, and that was just a natural offshoot of it, because I started doing family research, and like other people, I had ancestors that fought in the war. One of the most notable ones, I think, was my great-great-grandfather, who was a 16-year-old guard on the walls at Andersonville. And I've often thought about the sights that he had seen there. But as my dad said, my dad was a life member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He told me once, he said, "This is the most natural thing I've ever done in my life." He said, "The organization I'm joining just because of what I am. I am a son of a son of a son of a Confederate soldier." So it's just it's a bloodline thing. It's a heritage thing, and one that we certainly embrace here. And we, Ben Jones played Cooter on the Dukes of Hazzard. He's fond of saying that we're the same good people we were yesterday and the day before, and we're not going to be ashamed out of our heritage. And Lord help me, I'm not going to be ashamed out of a good heritage that I've been given.
And so you had mentioned, the thousands of men who were mustered into Confederate service for Macon. And I know that was one of the inspirations for the book. But what exactly inspired you and Kevin to write the novel that you wrote?
We wanted to tell the story of the men who went from here. As many as went out from here, I don't really know of a lot of books that have been written about Civil War Macon as it was. There have been some that have come out in the past few years. Kevin and I have been working on this for 20 years. I mentioned there was a book that came out here on Camp Oglethorpe recently. I know the author of it, and he worked on it 15 years. So as you know, books take a while. They really take a while. And it was one of those things that Kevin and I would write on. There was a time when we kind of put it on the shelf for a while, and then we said, "No, let's get this down. We're going to finish this. Whatever happens to it, we're going to finish it." And so we knuckled down and finished the last few chapters and tried to, see if we could get it published. And at times it looked like, selling a book is one of the hardest things probably you'll ever do in your life, because, people more or less have the attitude of the last thing this world needs is another book. But, I guess there's always room for one more.
I guess it was maybe about 2 years ago that you gave me the manuscript. Had you recently finished it, or had you sat on a finished work for a while at that point?
We'd probably been finished with it a year and a half, because we had tried, honestly, going through Mercer University Press here, not really going to them directly and saying, "Would you publish this?" But they hold a contest here every year in which you can submit novels And if yours is selected, you win a publishing contract. Simple as that. And we entered that twice and didn't win, so we just said, well, that's probably a dead dog there. And really had nowhere to go, and really had no plans with it until you mentioned one day in your newsletter that you were looking for manuscripts. And I guess the rest is kind of history there.
And so when you told me the other day that this was a 20-year labor of love, was that 20 years ago from now, or was that 20 years ago from 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
Roughly 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, we started it probably around 96, I think it was when the first words were written. If I remember correctly, it was along in the mid 90s, somewhere in there, because I remember my dad passed away in 95, and we were writing sometime after that. So that's the nearest I can come to it there without going back and doing some research as far as, but it was somewhere around Thanksgiving, probably of 96, that we actually put the first words on paper.
And so is that why then in the introduction or the foreword, is that why you chose for that to be a letter that was written by one of the characters in the book on Thanksgiving Day?
Yes, it is exactly. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. I was sitting by my desk, which overlooking the window, and it was Thanksgiving morning. And of course, from the kitchen was coming all the smells of Thanksgiving. I had my cup of coffee there on the desk, and I just simply started writing from that moment, kind of blending the character from the past to myself, my situation then. But you're exactly right. That's exactly the way that happened. It was literally written on Thanksgiving morning, the introduction there.
So I have to ask you the question then, since the character in the book was writing his letter and he was drinking his coffee just as you were, and he mentions that he was drinking from a rusted cup. Were you drinking from a rusted cup?
Well, it's very weathered. I have one that I've carried with me many years, and it does have some rust pits on the outside, I must confess. But it was kind of, as he noted in there, it was a memento from the war. That one of the few things he had kept maybe as a souvenir from that time period, because there was much that he really wanted to forget. But I guess it was somewhat like, as you know, the Sam Watkins book. Sam wrote, 20 or 30 years after the war. And maybe that was somewhat of an influence on our book, simply maybe the format that he had of just sitting down and just remembering back through the pages of your memory what happened. And as such, it almost really took on almost a diary form as such, because I think we wrote an account every day for about 6 months. I mean, he went to bed at night, he got up the next morning, he did this, he did that, and so it was almost like a running diary.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. At the beginning of the book, you mention a cast of characters, and kind of just you don't have to go through the whole list, but just maybe 4 or 5 of the main characters, just for people to kind of get a feel of the book. Tell us who was in it.
Well, if there's a central character, there's Greg. He is a young man here in Macon. Certainly, it revolves around him, his father, Ben, who runs a blacksmith shop. Very ordinary characters. He has a couple of buddies. The opening passages of it, they're actually out deer hunting on the banks of the Okmulgee River here in Macon in January, which is, there again, we write about what we know. We know the terrain. We know what it's like here then. They're very ordinary characters. Like all young boys, they grow up, they get into this, they fall in love, they have jobs, they have disappointments, they go to church. The rumors of war are swirling all around them, and they're wondering how this is going to affect their lives. And their patriotic spirit, of course, drives them into the Macon Guards, which are a militia group that started there, which eventually becomes Company C of the 8th Georgia. And it's just kind of an evolution. We chose very ordinary characters, much like ourselves, we thought, and very ordinary passions of people. We just wanted to be like that. Like there's so many nameless privates that fought that war. Our SCV camp out in Jones County, we called it the Camp of the Unknown Soldier, because nothing was more horrible, I suppose, or more of a dread of a soldier than going off to war and not only losing his life. Maybe he didn't fear for losing his life, but when a soldier's unknown, he not only has lost his life, he has lost his identity as well and his legacy somewhat. So we just stuck with very ordinary people, tried to reconstruct what we could, what was 1860, 1861 Macon, from what still exists, which is quite a lot here. If you come to Macon, if you want to see a building that was built in the last 150 years, we've probably got it somewhere. A great many movies are made here for that reason. A lot of it's preserved. So there's a much that we could trace as far as where they were, what they did, where they lived, and so forth, like that. Of course, historical fiction puts back in what the historians leave out, the little more or less mundane nuances of life, the everyday details that they've minded I thought was so important, or even writers from that time period may have not thought was so important, but we did. That's what colors in, makes the fabric of life. I had one friend that read it in the early days, and he felt like he said he felt like he was really experiencing 1860s Macon. And I thought, well, great. That's what we tried to convey as writers.
Right. Well, I got the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, you can tell me. But I got the impression that when a lot of these young men signed up for the Macon Guards, especially Greg's father Ben, they had no idea that they were going to wind up as far away as Manassas. They just figured that they would, that they would be the home guard. They would be the guys who would be there to defend the city should the Yankees ever come that far south, and maybe go help a neighboring city or something. But I don't think they expected to wind up all the way up in Virginia.
Exactly. And I'm glad that point came through, because that was one of the things we tried to maybe drive home. I will never forget, do you remember during the days of the first Gulf War, it was going on hot and heavy, and over there involved in that was a group of Ohio State National Guardsmen that had been sent over there as a water detail. That was their job, to supply water where it was needed. That was their only job. Somehow enemy missiles hit where they were at, and a number of them lost their lives. Those people never thought that, had any idea they would ever die in combat or even be close to it, I'm sure, not when they joined. But I'm of the belief that anytime you put on a uniform, be it a fireman, soldier, policeman, whatever, it may cost you your life in the long run.
I remember there was one part of the book in particular, I don't remember what chapter it was in or where it was in the timeline of the book. I just remember one of the characters, saying something to the effect of they hope they didn't have to go to Tybee Island. And, Tybee Island really isn't that far from Macon. And so I'm thinking if they didn't want to go to Tybee Island, they certainly didn't want to go through the Carolinas and into Virginia.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I've read about guys that were, say, at Gettysburg from Bibb County, as they wound up there eventually and walked there, for most part. Some of these guys had never been out of the county, and then to be at Gettysburg, wherever in the world that is, they must have thought they were at the ends of the earth. And as such, we tried to portray too. Tybee Island is a resort area today. It was no resort during the war. I had been down to Fort McAllister, which is now down near Savannah.
So you mean they weren't just hanging out at the beach and eating hot dogs?
Oh, no. The insects, for one thing, are absolutely terrible down there. I read accounts where they would literally drive soldiers insane down there. And that's why we made such a deal of it there, where they were trying to find something to do away with those bugs or repel those bugs. And they used many things like wax myrtle and learned to use some of the local herbal things like that. But Tybee Island was terrible. I mean, I've been down there, like I said, at McAllister in February for black powder training. And I don't know what they were, but there was something that was just making a feast of us. And I told somebody, I said, if I could put one of these critters under a microscope, I bet he'd have teeth like a piranha. Because I mean, they were really, it wasn't like stings. They were chewing your flesh. And so without some means of combating the insects, it must have been just awful there.
Well, all I can say is their experience on Tybee Island was different from mine. The one time I had been there, William Shatner negotiated me a nice motel room there on Priceline, and spent the day at the beach, ate dinner at Paula Dean's restaurant in Savannah that night. Nothing like you said, like what it would have been like at that time or during a wartime.
Oh yes. And of course, mosquitoes. It's been theorized that people could not live in the South, especially in Georgia, if not for the bat. Bats eat so many mosquitoes. They can really be terrible here. I mean, Georgia is almost tropical at times.
Well, I was preaching in. I'm trying to remember the name of the town now. I can't remember it. But when you're coming up to Brunswick on I-95 from Florida, you get to the first Brunswick exit and you go west a few miles, and you're right in this town. And forgive me for not remembering the name of it. But you're also right on the northern bank of the Okefenokee Swamp.
Oh, yes.
And, I unless you've been there, I guess people just don't realize, it's just that. I mean, it's a swamp, it's a jungle, it's humid. Mm-hmm.
Until you have, in September here, this past September we just passed, we had probably, I would not be exaggerating if I didn't say we had at least half of the month was above 100 degrees during the day, and we didn't have enough rainfall to even measure. So you have all kind of extremes. We had Hurricane Irma, we had Hurricane Michael roll right across Macon the last couple of years. I've seen 18 inches of snow here. I've seen 6 degrees. I've seen 106. So, you can expect anything in Georgia. It's a greatly varying terrain, and here we're only a couple hundred miles from the coast in Macon, and it could be just I don't know. My wife is from Washington State, and she calls this the Wild Wild East, and because it's so different than Washington State, of course. But it can be a very hard land in some ways, but there are benefits. For instance, just about anything under the sun grows here if you can get enough water to it. Animal and plant. I think you've got every species of venomous snake in North America here represented here in Georgia. And we had some events. An event up at Pickett's Mill back this summer. I did not get to go to it, but our guys came back just consumed in chiggers, which is a miserable experience.
So how does a nice boy from Georgia meet a girl from Washington State?
She's been here. She came here from she was an Air Force veteran actually, and came here, and she was married previously, and in fact our children grew up as friends in reenacting. for years, and then as time went on, we became married to other people, and that was that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's it's odd because before we got married, we had been friends for about 20 years. So it's just one of those things that, I guess the Lord foresaw, and we sure didn't see it coming.
Well, I'll give you a joke to tell to your wife one day.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what was that?
I said I'll give you a joke to tell to your wife one day.
Okay, great, all right.
And God was creating the universe. He was creating the earth in particular on this particular day. And the Bible says that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and it says, and basically it talks about how God is talking,
yes,
to himself basically. But if you look at that in the theological sense, it's really the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are basically having a conversation during the creation.
Right, yes, absolutely.
And so the Holy Ghost is saying that we're going to create this place here on the earth, and it's going to be the most beautiful place on the earth. And it's going to have the most beautiful trees, and it's going to have the most beautiful mountains, and it's going to have the most majestic streams. And it's going to be a place where you can fish, and a place where you can hunt, and it's going to be the most greenest, most beautiful. It's going to be the pinnacle of our creation. And so the Father asks the Holy Spirit. He says, well then, he says, if we put all of everything into this one spot, he said, what are we going to do with all the rest of the stuff? And what are we going to call this place? And so the Holy Spirit says, well, this place, this beautiful place, we're going to call it Washington. And as for all of the corruption and all of the stupidity and all of the ugliness, we're going to put that on the other end of the continent, and we're going to call that Washington too.
Oh man.
So yeah, you can decide which Washington is the good one and the
yeah.
bad one, but I think you know which Washington is the bad one.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, it kind of leaves it for speculation there or interpretation. Yeah, she's also she's a very godly lady, and I thank God for that because I've not always had a Christian mate in life, and that's just one of the great blessings of my life is having someone to share like precious faith with. She's also my writing partner. We are finishing up the third historical fiction book here for the Cannonball House where we work, dealing with the people that actually lived in this house. And we've had a great time with that, just enjoyed that so much.
So do you have a local printer then that has been printing those, or how is
yes,
that?
we just use someone that actually we use a printer that does our stationery for us here. And they're little kind of paperback like books. They're really aimed at being kids' books, but when you say kids' books, we're talking probably 4th, 5th, 6th grade and up, like that. We've made them teaching books because when we write about something, so many of the things we include in it are things that you can come here and physically see. If they eat something, like if they, we have a shortbread cookie here that we're famous for giving out to tours that come in. It's a period recipe. We included that in the book. So it's kind of a book that you could teach history out of, like that. And of course, the whole purpose of the book was to draw attention to the house. And we just had a ball doing that because we get to research Macon and I guess dream of what it was like in those days.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about
You
it.
were writing about Macon in the book. What was kind of some of your source material? What were you drawing from when you were trying to paint the picture of life in Macon in 1860-61?
We simply went with as many diaries as we could. There were so many things that we had to, just greatly study to make sure we had it accurate. I'll give you one example. There was a mistake we almost made, and we pray there's no other glaring ones in there like this. We corrected it, of course. But we had at one point there, we had some prisoners that were being transported to the penitentiary, the federal penitentiary at that time, and we had that down as Atlanta. It was not Atlanta at that time. It was in Milledgeville, where the state capitol was at the time, in the governor's mansion. In fact, it was right across the street from the governor's mansion. And that was an error that we almost made. And, going back through things, so we had to constantly research because, yes, it's fiction, but you want your facts to be solid facts. You've got to have something to anchor on. And so there were many books here on Macon as far as the history of Macon. Macon's a town that has preserved its buildings. So many of the buildings are still here that were here during that time period. I mean, you can walk in the doors. You can. We were researching, for instance, one street in particular, and had an 1860 drawing of the buildings in the street and all of that. Every doorway, every building, every turn of the street is still there. There's just so much here to work with. In many cases, they're period photographs, so you can speak with some authority about what you're speaking about. Some of you have to interpret, like, well, where did Ben live? Where did Greg live? And things like that. But there's just so much source material here in Macon, and particularly in fact, we have the Washington Memorial Library here in Macon. It is one of the premier research facilities in the Southeast. It is really, they have an archives and genealogy department there. They helped a lot. It was so much material to draw from. So we're fortunate in that respect. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, was your wife, you said she was your writing partner on some newer projects. Did she contribute any to Macon to Manassas?
No, she did not. It was done, actually, the lion's share was done before we were married.
Okay.
I was actually married to someone else when I began the book, and we were married. My current wife Brenda and I were married as I was writing the final few chapters on it like that. So she was not really involved with that. And Brenda never really saw herself as a writer until our boss at the Cannonball House came to us and just asked us, said, "Would you write a series of books on the house?" And Brenda never saw herself as a writer. She's a born storyteller, though. It's like in our book, Kevin is a master of plots. I remember when we were first starting the book, he said, "I'll do the plots, I'll do the storyline, you got the dialogue." I said, "Well, gee, thanks, man. I mean, I'd never written much dialogue in my life." So that was kind of the way we divided up the book somewhat. And then with dialogue, sometimes it takes off on little tangents and little rabbit trails. So that was sort of the way the book was written. But no, she was really not involved in that book.
Okay. So what was the kind of the storyline? Kind of give us the synopsis or the storyline of...
young men growing up in Macon, living a very ordinary life. A very extraordinary event comes in their life. Probably one of the most extraordinary events that's ever been in all the annals of American history. I can't think of a more extraordinary 4 or 5 years than those war period years. Lives changed dramatically in that war. America has fought everybody under the sun for their freedom and the history of the nation. They've never fought anyone like they did each other. I guess that's inherent with a civil war as such, if you want to call it that. There was a certain viciousness that we went at each other with that I doubt we went at with the Japanese or the Germans or you name it. And I cannot imagine. I think of it sometimes, with all the turmoil our nation is going through right now, we've not gone to armed conflict against each other yet. I saw a cartoon the other day that wasn't one bit funny, I don't think, but it was entitled "The New Civil War," and it showed East against West instead of North against South. And so I guess what I'm saying is this is a man that was caught up in an experience that they never saw coming. I mean, their lives were very ordinary. They went to church. They worked their ordinary jobs. They hunted. They fished. They were going to grow up and fall in love and get married and have kids, and then one day go to their rest in the cemetery.
Well, Greg did get married and have a child during the course of the book.
No, they did not. In fact, he had a girlfriend, Marianne, and all, but the book was left hanging right for a series, I guess you'd say. We just got to first Manassas, for instance, and left them at the end of the book, at the end of that battle. I won't give away the end of the book, of course, but it's really, you could write for years on this. I was talking to Kevin recently, and he said, "I just don't know if I've got it in me right now."
Well, the last few chapters were just the first day of the Battle of Manassas.
Yes, right. It just kind of drops off right there. There's one, of course, very similar event that happens that greatly affected that particular combat unit, and that was the death of Bartow. Colonel Bartow, was killed, and that was a devastating blow to a much adored commander early in the war there. And I said, at one time we said, well, this is going to be a series. This will just go through Manassas, and we never dreamed it would be nearly 600 pages on just getting there.
It came out at 594 pages, and that was with a 12-point Times New Roman font. Had I used the Calibri font, which is the font that I actually prefer to use in setting up a book because it's clear, it's easier to read. But the reason I use Times New Roman is because that was the font that they used in books of the period.
Oh, yes.
And so, it was kind of trying to give it the feel of an older book, if you will.
Right.
But had I gone to use the 12-point Calibri, which is the font that I would have normally used, it would have been about a 700-page book.
I think I was using Verdana, I think, is what I had it in. And it was up there around approaching 700, 700 there as well. It kind of took on a life of its own. It really did.
And I'll admit, too, there was another reason that I went to that Times New Roman font to cut the page count down. Because the book that's retailing at $29 probably would have had to have retailed at $39.
Oh, yeah.
If it had the extra 200 pages.
This is something that Kevin and I talked about quite a bit. I hate to use this term on it, but it kind of amounts to, in some ways, a Civil War soap opera.
I mean,
because of the daily lives, the ups and downs of the daily lives. I don't know that's a bad thing, because hopefully it will entice readers to, be caught up in it and want to see where this is heading, because we tried to simply create the ordinary fabric of life. These people were nobody out of the ordinary. They were nobody that you would single out, and that's what we were trying to convey, the life of the ordinary man, because to me, there was no higher rank in the war than the private Confederate soldier. He was the most important man of that war. The foot soldier's always the queen of battle. He's always the most important one, and often those are just such nameless people.
Well,
I was watching. Go ahead.
I was going to say, even Ben, you would think him being an older gentleman, the way he was kind of brought into the unit more as a craftsman to make supplies for the unit. You would think that he would have ended up becoming one of the early officers, but he did not.
Right, yeah, there were some people that I guess were just more valuable. I had one ancestor in the 48th Georgia that was time he joined, and he was of a prime age. He wasn't an old man at all. They took the rifle out of his hand and made him a teamster. Somebody that could really handle a mule team without getting himself killed was kind of, valuable guy. And I read an account the other day of a Confederate soldier, and his whole job, he was up in North Carolina, was to gather herbs for medicines. That's all he ever did. So I think we think of everybody being soldiers and that, combat soldiers, but it just wasn't so. And if I could say this about it, when you're writing a book, you kind of have a mental image of characters, kind of stuck in your head. Same thing when you read a book, you probably get an image of what Greg looked like, what Marianne looked like, and so forth and all. Ben was one of my favorite characters, and I'll tell you exactly who the picture that came in my mind every time I wrote about him. Do you remember Ralph Waite played the father on the Waltons?
Yes, sir.
That was the image that came to my mind.
Okay.
He was just a good everyday family man, hardworking man, and just there to do what he could. Of course, the conflict arises against somewhat his son not really thinking war is necessary, I guess is a good way to put it, and yet not wanting to seem unpatriotic. Like that, and that really gets to be a real sticking point there, even to the point of some arguments. And I'm sure that was a scenario that was played out many times in life here in Macon and everywhere else.
Well, you even had a scenario there somewhat towards the beginning of the book where I believe the character's name was George, but I may be wrong, the cousin from New York who would always come down. And
that's exactly right.
And visit, and of course, now George is coming right as there's this talk of secession, and he's having to travel home by train as it's all happening, and of course they're worried about will he make it home safely? How are people going to treat him in town, knowing he's a Yankee when he's here? Are we going to have to fight against him in a few months?
Yeah, we that was Kevin's idea about George, and I thought it was a wonderful character because it did show that the war was not so simple as drawing a line across the United States. And
Well, it seems like that phrase was in there somewhere, that the only thing that makes him my enemy is an imaginary line. It seems like I remember that.
Yes. I think that was Kevin's line. That was a wonderful one, I thought. Well, for instance, when Sherman came through Georgia, his personal escort company was the 1st Alabama Cavalry. We got a sword donated here to the Cannonball House this year. That was a guy, I think he was in the 5th Georgia Infantry, and he was from Connecticut and was a lieutenant in the 5th Georgia Infantry. So, people crossed over. It was not quite so simple as, well, I'm from the North, I fight for the North, and I'm from the South, I fight for the South. And Greg and his family and George clearly loved each other, but they were on different sides. I mean, imagine being on different sides of battle with somebody you loved. I saw a letter years ago from a Confederate soldier. He and his brother was serving in the same company, and he was writing his mother about a battle they were in the day before, and he said, we had a real sharp fight yesterday, and I told my brother, he called him by name, he said, hold your fire, that's Papa leading that charge. So, it was quite a tragedy as far as people simply did not believe the same way.
I know this is kind of off topic a little bit, but I interviewed Clint Lacey a few months ago.
I see.
And he was talking about the Knights of the Golden Circle and how there were Knights of the Golden Circle people both north and south before the war. And so there were officers and even enlisted men who were part of the Order of the Golden Circle on both sides.
Right, yeah.
And how there were actually what would have been battles. And as the two armies approached each other, the officers at times would actually give Knights of the Golden Circle symbols, like hand signals and so forth.
Yes.
And then and if the commander on the other side responded to it, then they both decided, well, we're both, Knights of the Golden Circle, we're not going to attack each other today. We'll just let our armies pass by one another.
Right, yeah. And there were things that went beyond, being someone's enemy. There was that depiction, in the movie Gods and Generals of the Stonewall at Fredericksburg with the 24th Georgia firing on the Federal Irish Brigade as they came forward with tears in their eyes. It was a very conflicted time. The
North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org, and help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. You mentioned the Irish. I remember somewhere in your novel there was an Irish outfit or company that wound up falling in with them in their training. And
yes.
And I remember one of the characters, I don't remember who, but one of the Macon characters was amazed at how good compatriots these Irish were, given the fact that it shouldn't even be their war.
Oh, yes. They you find that and I really found many accounts there where the Irish greatly embraced this country. As you recall, Patrick Cleburne, I'll never forget, he came over and I'll never forget him saying the reason he joined the Confederate cause was he fought in the Irish Rebellion before he came over. And he said he came over and lo and behold, the cousins of the ones that he fought against over in Ireland were over here in America trying to start the same mess, and he said, I wasn't going to put up with it, like that. And so a lot of the conflicts transferred over, even into this war. And of course, I think, it's very easy to see that had England and France come in to the war, I think we'd have had the First World War.
Well, definitely, England and France would have come into the war had there not been a Russian naval blockade that prevented them from doing so.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we, and I don't know. It's just, there's so many what ifs. There's two paintings that hang in our house here. One of them is the colonel of the 61st Georgia, and the other is the lieutenant colonel. And I only mention that because on July 9th, 1864, the 61st Georgia was at the Battle of Manassas, Maryland. Lee was having a standoff with Grant at Petersburg. He told Jubal Early, he said, take 15,000 Confederates and cut loose and see if there's a way into Washington, D.C. Well, they fought the Battle of Manassas, and the two gentlemen that had their portraits hanging here lost their lives in that battle. But according to John B. Gordon's account, he rode to the breastworks of Washington, D.C., and they were empty. He said we could have walked in there without weapons. Now, generally, the thinking is that after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the South was dead and on the ropes. 15,000 Confederates in July of 1864 would have at least brought Lincoln to the peace table, And so even there was still a chance to win this thing or at least negotiate a peace.
Well, I know that
really all the South.
The General Lee had written somewhere, I remember reading this a number of years ago, that General Lee had written somewhere, maybe in his diary or maybe in one of his dispatches, that the reason that he continued to hold on and fight as long as he had was because the war, in his mind, was lost. I mean, he was doing the math in his head, how many men he had, how many men the Yankees had, what supplies he had, what supplies the Yankees had, what manufacturing capacity the South had, what manufacturing capacity the North had. He knew that whereas his men were dying, there was no one really to replace them, that in the North that there were boatloads of immigrants that were coming in every day that could be conscripted and handed a rifle and a uniform. And he was just doing all this, but he held out as long as he did because he had hope that a foreign power would intervene on behalf of the South.
Yes.
And when he finally got to Appomattox, he was still doing the math in his head, but he no longer had hope that foreign power would come to his aid.
Yeah.
And that was what ultimately drove him to begin, discussing surrender, because he realized that the foreign help was not coming.
Supposedly there was a letter already drafted saying that England was coming in had the South prevailed at Gettysburg. Supposedly that was already in the works, that that's all they had to do was win at Gettysburg, and England was in. I mean, I think the big thing the South wanted to do was for England to break the blockade, because if they broke the blockade, the South would have the arms and equipment they needed. Manpower might be another matter altogether. There's so many ifs and wish they were and things like that, but Jubal Early said that it was not practical to go into Washington, D.C. after the Battle of Manassas. He claims that the breastworks had been reinvested because the battle took so long. But frankly, I hold John Brown Gordon in a lot of esteem, and if he says so in his memoirs that the breastworks were empty, I tend to believe that. And like I said, 15,000 Confederates lying in the streets of Washington, D.C. would have got somebody's attention.
Well, you know, the crazy thing, you talk about Gettysburg and you talk about the Confederates marching on Washington, is the whole Battle of Gettysburg took place because of generals north and south disobeying orders.
Oh, yes.
Had both armies just followed their standing orders, the Confederates would have marched right through Gettysburg unopposed.
They would, or went to Harrisburg there. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible with that. You know, what I enjoy so much about Gettysburg is, you know, Lee really took a 80 to 100,000 man army into Pennsylvania undetected. You know, just right behind the Blue Ridge. That's pretty hard to do. I mean, they really were not aware that his army was there until they kind of bumped into him. And that's an amazing piece of generalship, I think.
And I think that might have been why the standing order was for them not to engage at Gettysburg, because I think that you know, the high command was a little far removed, and the intelligence reports that they had, they thought it was a much smaller army, and they would deal with it as it got closer to the capital.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, the logistics of handling an army of that size on the march in enemy territory has got to be just staggering.
Okay, so was there anything about the book that you're thinking about in your head? Maybe you're thinking you wished I would have asked, or you would have told us about it, but I never really gave you the opportunity?
There's one thing that Kevin and I wanted to do with the book. I know there was a lot of possible profanity in those times. You notice we don't use that in there. We don't even get into things that might have been somewhat off color like that. I wanted this to be a book you could read to anybody, or anybody could read without blushing. It's most of all, in all things we do, we wanted God to get the glory out of it. These were people that worshipped and honored God. Many of them there, maybe much more even than our generation does. And we wanted to point that out because we felt like that was historically accurate. And there again, we try to do everything with every breath we have in us to give glory to God, and hopefully He will get glory out of this. That may not be the popular byline these days, but it's simply the way we believe, and we're not ashamed of it.
Right. Well, you know, we had even, made a statement to that effect there on the back cover of the book.
Yes. You know, it's one thing. You remember the pledge you take in the SCV? They talk about being loyalty to God, who was so much a part of the character of the Confederate soldier.
Yes.
I firmly believe that. I believe that, there were people, and they were godless individuals then as they are now. But many of those guys, I had a pastor friend. He's actually a missionary to the reenactment community, I guess you'd call him. He must go to 40 events a year.
Is it Chaplain Farley?
The gospel. No, I know Alan Farley. Yeah, I know Alan very well. This is Reverend Joey Young, Reenactors Missions for Christ. I mean, old past Missions for Christ. He's out of North Georgia. But, he's an associate. He knows Alan very well. We had Alan Farley here in Macon years ago. Kevin and I did. We put on an event here called Gettysburg in Georgia back in '96. And Alan's a very fine gentleman. We think very highly of him. I'm not ashamed of the South. I'm not ashamed of my Confederate ancestry. And I'm sure I'm not ashamed of the gospel. There's no line to a song that said defeat is not dishonor. Man, it's not.
And that seemed like a really good place to end it. So that is where we're going to wrap it up today. Macon to Manassas, that great novel by our guest, John Wayne Dobson and Walter Kevin Sark. Christmas is coming up. These books make great Christmas gifts. If you have anybody on your shopping list who is interested between the war between the states, or who just likes to read a good work of fiction, this novel, Macon to Manassas, is the ideal Christmas present. It's available in paperback and hardback. For those of you who'd like to read it for yourself, and maybe you're not giving it as a gift, you can also get it for $2.99 as a Kindle edition ebook there at Amazon. Just go to Amazon.com, type in Macon to Manassas. That's Macon, Georgia, to Manassas, Virginia. Type in Macon to Manassas, and this book will come up, and you can order a copy. You'll be glad that you did. I also want to encourage you to go to the Barnes Review website, www.barnesreview.org. go to the bookstore. There's some great Christmas shopping to be done there as well. And go to www.dixieheritage.net. We do have a bookstore there where you can do some Christmas shopping. But more importantly, sign up for my newsletter. Sign up to receive a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And when you do, I promise there'll be no further cost or obligation. We're not going to hit you up to sell you something down the road. These are just free gifts from us to you. And so from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Until next week, God bless. See you soon. Have a happy Thanksgiving.